It was 3 in the morning. I was kneeling in the middle of a dark room, trembling, not from the cold, from fear. Hours earlier, I had destroyed my family's altar with my own feet. I had seen my mother fall to her knees in front of the shards, scattered across the floor. I had walked out the front door convinced that I was doing the right thing. And now, in that impossible silence, someone had spoken my name, in the dark. Diego. There was no one there, no lit candle, no open window, no rational explanation, just an absolute silence and a soft golden light that seemed to spring from the air itself, filling the room as if the environment had begun to breathe. I, who had spent years explaining the whole world with logic, data, and technical arguments, had not a single equation for that, and it was at that moment that everything I believed began to crumble. But before I tell you what happened that night, I need to tell you who I was. Because you need to understand the magnitude of the fall to understand the magnitude of the transformation. My name is Diego Herrera, 26 years old, industrial engineer, graduated with academic merit. The kind of person who believed that reason was the only valid currency in this world. That faith was an emotional inheritance of people who had not evolved enough. That praying was a waste of time for those who could be solving real problems. I grew up in a house where religion was not a custom, it was an identity. My mother, Teresa, maintained an altar in the center of the living room that occupied not only the physical space, but the heart of that family. Fresh flowers every week, candles carefully aligned with almost ritualistic care, old photographs framed around the image of the Virgin Mary. Every day, without fail, without haste, she would kneel there and pray softly. I saw that and thought, what a waste, how ridiculous. In college, I learned to dismantle beliefs with precise arguments. Professors praised me for my ability to debate without emotional appeal. Friends validated me with every post made on the internet, every argument won, every belief publicly dismantled. I absorbed all of that like someone discovering a superiority that they never wanted to let go of. I said I wanted to free my family from the shackles of religion, but what I really wanted was to prove that I was right. The problem was never my mother's faith. The problem was my pride. And that December night, my pride went too far. What I did that night changed everything. And the consequences were far worse than I could have imagined. I had arrived home that night already inflamed with anger. The whole week had been filled with discussions about religion as a mechanism of social control. Renata and Ivan, my closest colleagues, fed my certainties with articles, arguments, and constant approval. I came home with my head boiling and a voice inside me that kept repeating, "This has to end." I opened the living room door, and there was the altar. More illuminated than usual that night. Fresh flowers, extra candles, a soft scent in the air. My mother was finishing the rosary, her lips moving silently, her eyes closed. That seemed like provocation to me. It wasn't. I know that today. But at that moment, with everything boiling inside me, I saw no love. I saw an obstacle. I shouted that it had to end. My father got up and tried to intervene. My mother opened her eyes slowly, without panic, with that serenity that always destabilized me more than any argument. I didn't want dialogue. I wanted confrontation. And it was driven by that voice and the blind certainty that I was doing the right thing, that I lifted my foot and kicked the altar hard. The wood gave way with a dry crack. The image of the Virgin Mary toppled to the side, swayed for a second, as if resisting, and fell. The sound of the plaster breaking echoed through the house like a gunshot. The candles rolled, still lit, spreading hot wax across the floor. The flowers were crushed under my own steps. My mother let out a low moan and fell to her knees, crying in front of the shards. My father looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. It was not just anger. It was a disappointment so deep it cut more than any words. "Get out of here now," he said, in a firm, low voice. I was still consumed by arrogance. I responded that I was freeing the family from a lie, that someone had to have the courage to do what I did. I grabbed my backpack and walked out the door without looking back. Outside, the air was cold. My heart was racing, but not from regret. I still convinced myself that I had done what was necessary, but one image wouldn't leave my mind. My mother's hands trembling as she touched the pieces of the broken image. I pushed that to the back of my mind and moved on. I still didn't know that the worst was yet to come, and that the price of my pride would be much higher than I could ever imagine. In the following days, I tried to normalize what had happened. At work, I maintained my confident demeanor. Renata and Ivan, who already knew what I had done that night, said I had been brave. That many people never confront their own families. I smiled, accepted the compliment, and pretended that it was enough. But at night, alone in the apartment, the silence weighed differently. I closed my eyes and saw my mother kneeling on the floor. I saw her hands carefully picking up the shards, as if trying to save something that could not be repaired. The scene returned with a clarity that no argument could erase. I called home a few times. No one answered. A week later, my father sent me a short message without greeting, without a comma. "Your mother is not well." I read that 3 times. I tried to respond naturally. I said she would get through it, that it was a passing emotional impact, that time would heal. My father didn't say anything more. It was the first time I felt the real weight of what I had done. A few weeks later, he finally answered a call. His voice was different, more tired, more distant. He said my mother hadn't been sleeping well since that night, that she barely ate, that she spent hours sitting on the couch, staring at the empty space where the altar had been. I tried to downplay it again. He interrupted me. The doctor had used a specific word, severe depression. Hearing that felt like the ground giving way beneath my feet. The psychiatrist had explained that the traumatic episode had triggered a severe condition. He talked about medication, ongoing support, constant vigilance. It wasn't emotional exaggeration. It was a technical diagnosis, exactly the kind of language I had always said I respected. "She doesn't want to talk to you," my father said. The phrase echoed inside me for days. I hadn't destroyed wood, plaster, and glass. I had broken something inside her. It was during this phase that I began to notice something that frightened me deeply. My rational stance was becoming as rigid and violent as any fanaticism I criticized. I defended reason, but had acted with emotional brutality. I spoke of freedom, but had imposed a rupture. I claimed to combat illusion, but perhaps I was just fleeing from the fear of admitting I didn't have all the answers. And then a question began to arise, small at first, but growing every day. What if I was wrong? Not about religion, not about faith, about myself, about who I had become. I still didn't know what to do with that question, but it wouldn't leave me in peace. And it was that question that put me on a bus home one cold winter morning. I didn't wait for courage to appear. I took the first available bus and spent 6 hours sitting, looking out the window, unable to sleep. My mind replayed the same scene on loop. My mother kneeling, the shards on the floor, my voice cutting through the silence of that room like a knife. When I arrived, the house felt smaller. Or maybe I had grown in the wrong way for too long. The corner of the room where the altar had been was empty. The wall still bore the dark mark of where it had always been. That absence wasn't silence. It was accusation. My mother was in the bedroom, thinner, quieter. When she saw me walk through the door, her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of anger. They were of exhaustion, of a deep exhaustion, the kind that doesn't go away with a good night's sleep. Before any words came out, I knelt beside the bed. I hadn't planned that. My body acted before my mind decided. I asked for forgiveness, not as an argument, not as a structured speech, just as a son who finally stopped fighting against his own heart. She reached out and held my hand with a gentle strength I hadn't expected, and she said a phrase that dismantled everything that was left of my armor. "I never stopped praying for you, my son." What I had called superstition had survived my violence. It had survived my absence. It had survived every cold word I had thrown at her over the years. That week, we began to rebuild the altar together, not out of obligation, out of care. We went together to choose a new image of the Virgin Mary. We bought simple flowers, discreet candles. Each object we placed in its place carried a different weight now. It wasn't just about assembling an altar, it was about repairing something I had broken inside a person who had never done anything but love me. And I saw the light returning to her eyes, with each piece placed in its place. On the night we finished, my mother prayed quietly and went to bed early with a peaceful smile on her face. I stayed alone in the living room, looking at that altar rebuilt with my own hands. There was a strange peace there, not mystical, not dramatic, just silent and real. I still didn't believe, but I no longer despised, and something inside me knew that night wasn't over. I went to the bedroom, I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Because at 3 a.m, something happened that I will never be able to explain with any equation in the world. It was exactly 3 a.m. when I heard it, a gentle sound, like fabric moving in the air of a completely closed room. My feet took me to the living room before my mind decided anything, and then I stopped. A scent of roses filled the entire room. It wasn't the scent of the flowers we had bought. It was something I had never felt in my life and yet seemed familiar, as if I had been born knowing it existed. The room was illuminated. No lamp, no streetlight, a soft golden light that cast no shadows and came from nowhere. It was simply there. I was frozen. And then my name was spoken, Diego. A tenderness impossible to describe. It was neither a man's voice nor a woman's. It was simply the gentlest voice I had ever heard in my entire life, and it knew exactly where to touch inside me. I felt no fear. I felt recognition, and then came the question. Simple, without accusation, without judgment. Why did you fight so hard against love? I tried to rationalize. It was fatigue, it was stress, it was guilt. But each word dissolved before reaching any conclusion. That presence did not debate. It simply was there. And that was more powerful than any argument I had ever formulated in my life. I fell to my knees, not out of fear, not for performance, because something inside me finally gave in. Images passed through my mind in silence. My young mother learning to pray with my grandmother, my family going through hardships that I had never bothered to ask about. Faith not as a delay, but as the only thing that sustained that house in moments when everything could have collapsed. And then came a phrase that stayed with me forever. God is not explained. God is felt. When everything ceased, the room returned to silence. No candle lit. No light, no voice. Just me kneeling on the floor with a wet face and a heart lighter than I remembered feeling. The next morning, I accompanied my mother to the psychiatrist. The doctor looked at her, looked at the chart, and simply said, "The improvement was unexpected." I didn't need any further explanation. I had witnessed a miracle. Months later, I started attending catechesis for adults, not out of pressure from anyone, but out of a genuine search that my heart was asking for. Father Esteban welcomed me with a calm smile and said something simple that completed everything. Faith matures when pride falls. The following year, I received the Eucharist for the first time. My mother was in the front row with eyes shining in a way I will never forget. Today I continue to be an engineer. I continue to use logic, method, and analysis every day. But I no longer use this as armor against what I cannot measure. I learned that reason without humility turns into arrogance, and that the greatest miracle of that night was not my mother's recovery. It was God finding me exactly where I was, kneeling in the dark, without any answers up my sleeve. If this story touched something within you, write here in the comments, God is not explained, God is felt. That way I will know you've made it to the end and that these words found the right heart. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this testimony with someone you love. Help me spread this love throughout the world. Thank you for staying until here. May God and the Virgin Mary always be with you. Amen.